Good morning, everybody. We'll just give it a few more minutes for more people to join, and then we'll kick off the webinar. So good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Winning the Privileged Access Battle from Firefighting to Field Control. My name is Katrina Garner. I am the Field and Channel Marketing Manager for EMEA here at Silverfort, and I'm really excited to be introducing you all to my colleague, Rob Ainscough, our Chief Identity Security Advisor, who will be presenting on this topic for you all today. So just before I hand over to Rob, there are a couple of housekeeping items I want to quickly mention. If you have any questions for Rob during the session, please make sure to submit these in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and we'll answer these once the presentation is finished. I also want to let you all know that this webinar is being recorded and the full recording will be sent over to you. So if you need to drop off early or anything, not to worry, you'll be able to watch this back anytime on demand. I think that's everything. So without further ado, I'll pass it over to you, Rob.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Kat. So morning, everyone. Great to see you all. Thank you all for joining. Really do appreciate it. So as Kat said, I'm Rob Ainscough, so I'm Chief Identity Security Advisor in EMEA at Silverfort. Prior to being at Silverfort, I was at a really major UK retailer for a number of years. I ran the IAM program there for about 10 years. So that was a long, long time. And I was working in a very, very complex environment. So in terms of kind of contextualizing that, so we're talking 400,000 plus employees and third parties. So really, really large base of people to protect, over 1,000 systems. And that was right from, mainframes up to containers. So very diverse hybrid environment. And ultimately, we were able to protect millions of accounts, millions of entitlements. So I was responsible for IGA, so access governance, single sign-on with MFA, and also privileged access management. And there's some really big numbers on here, right? That makes us all feel good from a management perspective, like we must be in control, right? We're protecting millions of things. But the reality is this was a multi-year, almost decade-long journey for us to get this to this maturity. And really, still, we weren't done. There's still plenty of risk out there that we weren't able to close. And when I think back over my time there, it was really a game of two halves. I'll use a lot of sports analogies today. I'm really into sports. So that's apologies for that if you're not into sports, but it was a game of two halves. So, the first half, we really tried to apply the kind of recipe of the industry, the standard technologies. And we'll go through today. We found that was slow. That was really difficult. And in the second half, we tried to do things a little bit differently. And that was enabled by Silverfort. It's a lot of the reason I'm here today, because when I look at the threat landscape that we're working in from an identity perspective, it's changing rapidly. We'll talk about that more today in the coming slides. But I really think identity is very difficult to get right. And from a practitioner perspective, it's a really frustrating and kind of nervy place to be. Like you're always looking over your shoulder. You're never quite sure where you're at. And it's a very difficult place to be. And I really don't think it needs to be that way. And I think Silverfort's got a big part to play in that. And as I say, we'll talk about that. How do we build confidence, right? And that's what that second half for us was all about. How do we build robust confidence in where we're at so that we can be confident ourselves and be confident for our leadership as well? So to kick us off, we're going to talk about how the world's changing because we're really protecting increasingly complex environments. So it wasn't unusual, the environment I just described, hybrid environment, SaaS, on-premise, cloud, all going on, all needing protecting from an identity perspective. And that's particularly important because we've got the rise of what I call identity first attackers. So we'll go through this in more detail over the next couple of slides, but really attackers are starting to treat identity as the primary way that they're seeking to get into and cause damage within companies. So it's moving away from things like malware and vulnerabilities towards identity. And we're going to look into that, as I say. And that's coupled with a reduced technical cost of identity-based attacks. So they're increasingly quick, they're increasingly commoditized. You've got people like initial access brokers who are specialized in getting accounts compromised to get people into companies. And then you've got things like ransomware as a service. So obviously recently we've seen Dragon Force and where that's been used against UK retailers. So we're seeing a real evolution in those attacks towards identity-based attacks, but also them becoming more commoditized, which is a really difficult place for us as defenders to be. And we've got this famous phrase, hackers don't break in, they log in. So that was from the Microsoft CISO, I believe it was. And he's been saying that since 2019, right? This isn't new. This isn't something that's changed overnight. It's been an evolution, but it's been happening for a number of years. And when I think about the industry and think about how we protect ourselves, I really don't think the recipe that we've used for the last kind of 15, 20 years to protect companies is kind of optimized for this threat landscape, this change world that we're seeing now. And again, we're going to dig more into that today. So first, I thought we'd talk about identity first attackers and how they work. So we're going to build up a bit of an attack chain here about how this happens. So the first step is they're looking to compromise an account to get to initial access. Now, there are a ton of ways that they can do this, right? It is very, very difficult to stop because it's changing so quickly. So as defenders change what they're doing, so, maybe, MFA bombing was used in Uber in the breach there where, repeated MFA requests were sent through push notifications until they were accepted. People got wise to that, so we added things like number matching. But then the attackers are always pivoting their approach as well. We're seeing more info stealers, more session stealers, so that they're going past the MFA to gain access and gain valid tokens to access services. So what this means in the round is, this is always evolving. It's a cat and mouse game. And for me, from that kind of zero trust defensive assumption, we need to assume breach, right? These attackers targeting the human element, targeting identities to get that initial access. It's really, really hard to stop. And then once access is gained, what happens? Well, generally then it goes into lateral movement. So we're going to get in, do some reconnaissance, and then try and move within the environment. With the aim of escalating privileges, right? Getting from maybe an unprivileged account at the start to a position where they're in control. They've got privilege to do some damage in the environment. And then that leads to kind of two things. So we've got, often these are coupled actually by attackers today. So we've got data theft. So often attackers will try to steal data and then extort companies. And we've got ransomware, right? So that's kind of well known. But because of the complexity of the environments we work in, we also have vertical movement within the environment. So we've seen this in attacks where there's a pivot from on-premise and laterally moving within on-premise to maybe your IDP, to something like Okta or Entra, and into a different control environment. So maybe on-premise into the cloud, SaaS to on-premise, where we're syncing passwords and credentials between them. That really extends that risk surface from that account compromise and that initial account compromise. But once that happens, it's the same journey: privilege escalation, ransomware, data theft. For me, stopping this is the main challenge for identity leaders today, right? Given those identity first attackers, this is the number one challenge that we need to be addressing. And identity attacks need identity solutions, right? It's not enough to say, we've got EDR, we've got network controls, we're protected. really that leaves a lot of space for attackers, identity first attackers, to move within environments, which is then very difficult to stop. So if we bring all of that together, there's kind of three key things going on. So identity is the number one attack vector. Attacks are increasingly automated and rapid, as we've said, and hybrid environments are being exploited by attackers with that vertical movement between cloud and on-prem into SaaS, those kind of movements. So what does that mean for identity security and what we need to do, what's really important? Well, it means that every account is a risk, no matter how unprivileged it might seem. I've read about attacks where, completely unprivileged accounts have, been used for initial compromise, and then through lateral movement privilege escalation still results in, those really bad impacts for companies. The second one is because attacks are becoming increasingly automated and rapid, we need to be proactive, right? We need to protect, not just respond, right? As a security industry, we're really used to detect and respond. But as this becomes quicker, as the cycle times become quicker, and they are right now, we need to protect, we need to be proactive in our protection. And finally, we've got these hybrid environments. So we need to remove those silos. We need to level out our protection. Now, when we look at this, though, the question I ask myself, and having been a practitioner, having done this for 10 years, is do we have the right recipe for succeeding in this new world with these new requirements? Well, we're spending more than ever on identity security. So 18.5 billion last year, scheduled to grow massively over the next 4 years. But actually, we're seeing the same old problems. So 83% of companies surveyed experienced an incident from account compromise. So that was a couple of years back. So we're seeing the same old problems, despite the fact we're spending more on identity security. So do we have the right recipe? And the answer for me, as I say, having done this, is not quite, right? It's not that it's wrong or bad, but it's not quite optimized for what we need. And when we look at the history of where identity technology came from, it's pretty apparent why that might be. So generally, identity technology came from business drivers. So the first was efficiency, right? How do I get people up and running and working as quickly as I possibly can? So that's where access governance rose from, right? That business efficiency play, right? That's not about security. And then we had compliance, right? That includes things like access governance, IGA, as I've already said, but also things like PAN. And that was really driven by avoiding regulatory fines, reducing your cost of insurance, right? And these are all great drivers, but it's about balance, because really with these identity first attackers, we need, as I say, identity first defenses designed for it. And that's part of the problem, because these technologies were built for management, not security, right? So we talk about privileged access management. We talk about access management, right? And that's really about optimizing risk. It's about reducing the number of accounts, reducing the access, for example, locking things away, but it doesn't actually control our risk. And I think there's three important things here that I think about. So the first is, because they're about managing something, they're fragile, they're after the fact. So what I mean by that is they're applied on top of what's in your environment, right? So for example, privileged access management, right? We're going to identify an account and we're going to vault that account and manage the credential. So we're applying that on top of an account that already exists. It's not innate to that account that is protected, but we're putting protection over the top. When we talk about access governance, right, we're identifying effectively vulnerabilities in our access, right, where we've maybe got excessive access, for example, but that means that we've got to apply those controls. And the reason these are fragile is because they're applied over the top of the environment, over the top of the accounts and the access, because it needs processes like onboarding to get you coverage. It means they're fragile. So if your environment changes, if applications move, the controls don't move with them, right? So that gives us a problem, because it's not innate protection, because they weren't designed for security. So the second point is that they're difficult to scale. And this really comes back to the nature of the controls being applied over the top of our environments. It means they're incremental. We're doing this account by account, application by application, stepping forward, chipping away at that risk very slowly. And that onboarding process really means that your pace is dictated by people, right? You need to talk to people to make change. Say, hey, I want to vault these accounts that are used in this system with PAM. And that means we need to work at the pace of people and priority. And people are busy, right? They've got drivers other than security for what they do. And that can mean it's really difficult to scale these controls and close risk. And as we've already said, in this identity first attacker world, every account's a risk. We can't make any assumptions. So coverage is really, really key. The final is they're really hard to measure and explain, right? Because they're mainly progress or process metrics. So you say, hey, I've now onboarded 10 more applications. I've onboarded 100 more accounts. From a management position, what does that mean for my risk? What does that mean for my protection? What's left? What's the residual risk for me? It's a really, really difficult question to answer if you're using these. And that's a frustrating place to be if you're leading in identity, because you don't necessarily have confidence in your position. You know your progress, but what does that mean? What's my residual risk? Where am I not so good? And that's very difficult to articulate to management in terms of your progress, which leads to some difficult conversations. So what all of this leads to is that you're chasing your environment, right? You're trying to put controls over the top of something, right? And that's difficult because effectively you're asking for some change, right? I need to vault this credential, you need to work differently, right? I want to implement access governance, you need to help me with onboarding and the process of that. And I think of this as a slow lane to success, and that's from trying it. So we'll see what that looks like in a little bit when it was applied, in an enterprise. But all of that together kind of makes me think, do we have the tools to do our job, right? As identity practitioners, as security professionals, do we have the tools to do our job? And I use an awful analogy that for some reason I've put in this webinar. If you're starting off with this big block of marble and you're aiming to get to what's on the right, do you start with, tiny hammer and chisel, taking small bits of that away until you get to that final form? Or do you need to take control of that? Do you need to have, make some really big cuts to that to get it to 80% of what you want, and then finesse from there into your final shape? And that's what I think we're doing, right? That's what I think the background of these technologies as operational and compliance technologies means we're doing. And this is pretty unique across security. So if we parallel this with other areas of security, the evolution of identity technology is different. So when we think about the network, well, we've got network security tools. We think about endpoint, we've got endpoint security tools. Think about the cloud, we've got cloud security tools. And the key part about these three things is that they're tools optimized for scalability and control, and they're deployed everywhere. So from a network sense, you don't really get the conversations you get in identity where you go, I want to protect the top 100 accounts only. I only want to protect this application. You don't get that fragmentation. It's non-negotiable that you need that control everywhere, and you have technology to enable that. So it's really unique. Now, when this comes to it, right, all these things we've talked about in terms of the background and how it's different and the tools we have, what does this look like when you apply it? Well, here's some of my experience. So I had to, in my previous job, implement IT general controls for audit. So 5% of systems were in scope, right? Not particularly regulated, so not too many in scope systems. But it took more than 80% of my team's effort. And this is because of the nature of the technology, of those over-the-top controls, of us needing to kind of change and bend our environment to what we want, and to try and kind of bring that security level up from an identity perspective. And here's one of the highlights. This was mainly driven by privileged access management, and this is one of the highlights we saw. So we had one account that needed protecting in PAM, right? It took us 6 months to agree that protection. We had to escalate it to the C-level because no one knew what that account did. It was an old system, but a really important one. and the account, no one knew what it did. So, how can I agree to protect it, right? What's the impact going to be? Is it going to break something? You're applying that control over the top of your environment. Now, once we'd agreed it, it took 5 minutes to protect. 5 minutes. That's all it took. And that's really telling in terms of how you're able to quickly address risk in your environment. We've got an advisor at Silverfort called Eric Haller. So he was formerly head of the SOC at Palo Alto, former NVIDIA. And we were talking about this specifically. He said, the problem, Rob, from an attacker perspective, where your attack's scripted, having that protection, your long running project over here is a millisecond delay. It's an if statement to an attacker. And that's problematic in this world of identity first attacks. So we're going to look at the typical control environment. So this is a little bit conceptual, but we'll try and build up a picture here. So across the bottom, we've got our coverage, right? We've talked about every account being a risk. And on the vertical, we've got our risks managed, right? How are we controlling those risks? And we're going to put an arbitrary line of where we'd like to be from a risk position. So building it up in terms of the controls that we have, you'll have access hygiene, account hygiene. So through your IGA, you've got least privilege from an access perspective, things like RBAC to manage it, managing your requests, doing your reviews or UERs, depending on what you want to call them. From an account perspective, making sure there's no orphaned accounts that we don't know who they belong to, managing that life cycle, of joiner and leaver, and managing any configuration vulnerabilities. So these are all our kind of risk shaping controls, right? So we're reducing those accounts, we're managing down the number of accounts to what we need, the access to what we need, but that's really difficult in itself. And it doesn't close that whole risk, even if you're really, really, really good at that stuff, and most people aren't, that I speak to, because it is very difficult. That still leaves you with a large number of valid active accounts with access that could be exploited, that are using usernames and passwords. So I'm focusing here on privilege access, right? On infrastructure access, and particularly on premise. So then we bring in privilege access management. So we might do that for regulatory or compliance reasons. That's our main driver for privilege access management programs. But as I said before, they're difficult to scale, right? They're hard to get coverage. So often when I talk to people in the industry, we find that it's a relatively small proportion of their stuff is protected with privileged access because it is difficult. But there's two problems there. So the first is that it's not sufficient to close all risks in terms of privileged access. So we've got non-human accounts, service accounts, right? They're very difficult to vault. If you've got a third-party system, you're probably not going to be able to change it in a way that uses a vault to have those credentials stored securely. So generally, you then see credentials, in config files, that kind of thing, that makes it very difficult to then protect them. So how am I going to protect those service accounts? We've also got PAM avoidance, right? So if your PAM's configured to allow people to check out accounts for operational reasons, well, they can check them out and they can go round your session management, right? Just use them from your Bastion box or the workstation, however you're set up. So that's one of the problems. So it's not covering all those privileged access risks. And the second is that you've got this significant gap of coverage, which is where hygiene controls, these risk shaping controls we've got at the bottom, are your primary controls, right? We've already said that they don't close the whole risk, they shape it, but they don't manage that risk. And these are a target for attackers, right? This is where attackers will go. They're vulnerable to account compromise, lateral movement, privilege escalation, all of the things identity first attackers are looking to do. And ultimately that leads to ransomware and data exfiltration. And that's what I call the sleepless nights gap, right? From a practitioner perspective, I was always worried about this, right? What aren't we protecting very well? What's only on a username and password and could be exploited? And how do I close that gap, right? How do I do that? So this was the recipe that I implemented in my job. And there were problems with it, right? And I think there's two main things to call out. So one is it's a very uncertain place to be, right? You're running risk, but you can't really quantify what that risk is, right? What's that sleepless nights gap? What does it mean for us, right? We know we're worried about it, but what does it mean? What's the risk? What could happen? So whilst you're kind of focused on what you can see and what you're working on, for example, your compliance program, what other monsters are in your environment that you can't see that might be bigger, more meaningful, more damaging, right? If attackers were to exploit them. But generally, what this means is you're building high walls selectively. And as I've already said through what Eric Haller said, attackers are going to find the path of least resistance here. So whether it's, red teams, it could be auditors, it could be attackers. They're not going to go for the most protected stuff. They're going to aim for the weak points. And that's what we're kind of breeding through this privileged access management, because it's so difficult to scale these kind of after the fact controls that we're talking about. So we're not really in control of our environment. And when I think about this image here, right, and account compromise in general, the way I think about it is it's almost a strategic choice. It's an inevitable outcome of our strategies and our use of technologies in controlling privileged access, particularly on premise, which is actually where most of the attacks start, interestingly. So the question then is, how do we break the cycle? How do we break that cycle? How do we build a resilient identity security posture? The thing I come down to is we need to think the other way up. So what I say is, don't let your environment happen to you and try and apply controls over the top of it and be in that reactive response mode where you're chasing your environment. Oh, a new account's been created that's not protected. I now need to rush and vault it because I'm out of compliance or I'm not secure on something I really care about. But how do you take control of the environment, right? How do you own that identity risk in a way that's innate, that can't be worked around, that is by default? And that's what we're going to talk about in this second half, right? So this is talking about how I changed my approach. And there were three important things. We have to find a sweet spot of capabilities in technology to allow us to win in identity, to get to the fast lane, to get to control. So the first is it needs to be comprehensive, right? Cover the hybrid environment, humans, non-humans, service accounts within that. It needs to be comprehensive. We can't have those gaps that attackers can move through and exploit. We need it to be comprehensive. So the second is we need it to be robust, right? Policy-based. We need to be in control of our risk rather than having our environment happen to us and looking over our shoulder. And the third is it needs to work with your environment. So we can't really, if we want to cut this risk quickly, have system changes, right? We can't have difficult conversations with people about protection. We need to find a way to do this that is, innate, that is non-intrusive in terms of, changes to our environment. So a lot of the companies that I talk to, the kind of key message is, how can I be secure despite my history? Right? Despite 20, 30 years of building systems in ways that today maybe I wouldn't be proud of the legacy that I have. How can I protect myself despite those things, right? And that's where it needs to work with your environment. And that's where Silverfort comes in. Because really we're rethinking what identity security is, whereas previously it's primarily a discipline of compliance and primarily a discipline of efficiency as well from a governance perspective. Well, actually, identity security really is about containing risks. So I think of it as a ring of protection around your critical system. So we can say things then like all human users must MFA before accessing this system. Or we can say, I want to deny all authentications that use this insecure protocol that we don't need to support anyway. Right? I don't have to change my infrastructure to make that the case. I can do it with identity. Deny all users not in the finance group. I've got that level of control. And finally, deny any unusual service account activity, right? So, if I know what that service account always does, why should I allow it to do anything else, right? That probably is unusual or risky, right? So I've got control. I'm able to put this ring of control around my critical systems that mean I'm now taking control of my environment, my identity risk. And you really can't get round that, right? If a new account pops up and it's a human user, well, I've got a policy that says all human users must MFA before accessing, right? It's not tied to a specific account, but it can be generalized for your critical system. And we can do this across our environment. So identity security looks a lot like network security. I think that networks look a lot more like identity used to. So networks previously, they were the wall, right? Around the enterprise that protected us. They were there for security. But then as environments have got more complex, they've been much more about business enablement of hybrid, of SaaS, of these different ways of working technically. And identity previously has been operational and about efficiency, and now needs to move towards being more like the network was, that perimeter, right? That's key security layer. And that's what Silverfort can help with in terms of giving protection to what's most important to you. So if I talk about my role and what I did, so we're going to return to the diagram we built up earlier on in the webinar. Well, we've got that sleepless nights gap we talked about. We've got the edges to privileged access management around service accounts and people going around the PAM with vaulted credentials. Well, this is where Silverfort takes ownership of that space. So we've got MFA. We've got protection for non-human identities like service accounts, the ability to restrict them only to their regular and approved usage. Then we've got the authentication firewall saying, I want to deny this protocol because we don't even need it for this application. Why would I allow a vulnerable protocol to be open for that application? And we've also got privileged access security. So this is something new that we've introduced, which is about helping with tiering, right? Helping to prevent people moving between tiers in the environment, segregating them, making sure that they're not crossing, because that's a significant risk where you have, for example, tier 0 domain admins logging onto a workstation with their domain admin account. That leaves us vulnerable to a jump from a workstation to a domain controller. That's really, really important. So privileged access security, bringing that tiering and also just in time, right? Reducing that risk surface further. So how I think of that is an identity security flaw. So I said I like sports, and this is a sports analogy. So I watch a lot of American football. My wife absolutely hates it, but I really enjoy it. One thing they say in that sport is that the success that a team has is not about the performance of its best player on its best day, but it's about the worst player on their worst day. So it's not defined by the ceiling of the team, it's defined by the floor, right? The baseline, the bottom line. And that's where I apply that and think about it in identity terms, right? It's an identity security flaw. It's a bottom line. I can say that I can guarantee you'll get MFA'd when you're accessing a server or database. I can say that service accounts will only do what they should do. I can measure it, right? That's really important. I can measure it. I can describe it to executives. I can move from this position of uncertainty, looking over our shoulders about our risk, uncertainty about our risk, and with a view of everything in terms of authentication and this protection on top, we can say, hey, this is the bottom line. This is where we're at, and this is how it's performed. Here's where MFAs have been failed for risky authentications. Here where service accounts have been denied, right? We can prove it, we can measure it, we can articulate it. And that's really, really important. So really changing how we think away from building these high compliance-driven walls, to broad protection, a broad baseline that's innate, right? That protects the authentication itself and applies policy so that we can take control, because that's really what it's all about. It's about taking control. And that means we then get space and time. We talk about cybersecurity as a game of denying attackers space and time. And that's a lot of what we can do with the capabilities I've talked about here. But also it gives us as practitioners space and time to get really good at those risk shaping controls, to then take this block of marble that we've shaped to 80, 90% of what we want, and then we can start chipping away at the residual risk. So it's a whole different way of thinking about how we control privileged access risk, because we can buy confidence by saying we're protected, proactively, and then we can get good and do the detailed work. I always used to say to my team, we've got to build an umbrella of protection so we can do the detailed work underneath. And I think that's such an important way to think about it. And it allows us then to shape that risk and get really good at identity security. Um, so that's really what we did, right? So that was the change, right? Moving from this compliance-led high walls approach, which was very difficult to apply, very slow to apply, and couldn't have scaled to close our entire risk, to this threat-led identity security floor that we built with the Silverfort product. Now, there are a ton of other things that Silverfort does that we haven't talked about, right? We've got a ton of capabilities for cloud, for non-human identity outside of service accounts that we haven't talked about. There's a lot more there, but focusing down on privileged access is what we've done today, talking about the problems of privileged access, how we got here, and how to respond in this world of identity-first attackers. So I hope you enjoyed it. And I think, Kat, hopefully we've got some questions from the group.
Yes, we do. Thank you so much, Rob, for the webinar. That was brilliant. We do have a few questions. So the first one we've got is, do you have solutions for each of these layers? I think that was when you had the slide where you were showing the whole environment. That was the first.
Yes, yeah. So generally, that kind of slide. Oh, if I stop sharing for a moment, so that slide of the whole environment. Really, you've got your access governance across the bottom, managing that access, managing the life cycle. A lot of people use tools like SailPoint for that. And then you've got your privileged access management as well, which is a Vault solution. There's plenty of those on the market as well. So it's about those tools though working together, right? It's about how does, me giving access through IGA, through access governance, then feed into my identity security posture. How do I make sure that we're protected by default? How do I do that? So that's really key, but it's about bringing those disparate systems together to give you one posture everywhere so that you can describe it, and that's really key.
Great. And the next question we've got is, so how much effort is needed for PAS implementation?
Great question. So if you're already a Silverfort customer, you can literally turn it on. If you've already deployed Silverfort, it's about going to the right version and turning it on, right? You can turn on just in time. This is the beauty of policy. It's not about onboarding. It's not about all that change management, but it's literally done in clicks, right? So things that, in traditional ways have been really, really complex, you've had to negotiate with people. Now you can do that in clicks, right, in policy. So that's really important. If you're not already a Silverfort customer, it's a really, we've really thought about how you deploy this thing to make it as minimal as possible. You don't have to deploy agents or proxies on everything. We work with Active Directory, and then we're able to see all the authentication. So once that's deployed, again, it's about policies and what you want to do with the product.
Great. And I can see that person's just replied and said, awesome news regarding PAS, smiley face.
Very good.
So the next question we've got is, so how much can Silverfort do for Azure only environments?
Great question. So there's probably a couple of things to focus on here. We're a Microsoft partner, so frequently what we see is Azure customers are using Entra, they're using PIM, so they're using conditional access, they're using PIM to protect those Azure environments. What we're able to do is we're able to extend that for the hybrid environment. So from a security perspective and a user experience perspective, you get exactly the same experience. So whether you're logging on to, the Azure portal or elevating privileges in Azure, or you're, authenticating to PowerShell on-prem, we're able to bridge that authentication into what you're already doing, right? So we're able to bridge that into Entra for number matching via the Authenticator app. So you've got exactly the same experience all the way. We are able to provide protection for Azure natively from Silverfort. So if you want Silverfort to do all of it, we can do that. But most people are already using things like Entra, conditional access, and PIM to protect their Azure environments. So we're able to extend it so you've got that baseline everywhere, so you're consistent, and that's the really important thing.
Great. And then we've just got a couple more questions. So how far is the Resonate integration with Silverfort?
Great question. Great question. Super exciting stuff. I work for the ex-CEO of Resonate, Roy. Amazing guy, amazing technology they built in 2.5 years. I built a lot of technology in my previous role. I know how hard it is, and what they've done is phenomenal. The first release of that is early availability now. So that's coming through Cloud NHI. So what that does is it's identifying posture issues, things like excessive access, unused privileges for your NHIs, unrotated keys, those kind of things across all of the cloud platforms and another number of SaaS applications as well. So that's going early availability right now, I think. So that will be general availability in a couple of months. And then moving towards Q3 this year, it's the wider integration of Resonate. So that's all of the ISPM, if you like Gartner terms. So all of your vulnerabilities, all your threat detection as well, is coming on board there. So that's kind of Q3 this year. That will be going out to the market. So super exciting stuff where we're really seeing the ability to do this stuff everywhere starting to come on stream really meaningfully.
Great, thank you, Rob. And yeah, just to echo what you said, very exciting about having Resonate with us. Just one final question we've got. So, do you have any recommendations regarding the type of MFA that would be most effective, particularly given the rise of socially engineered attacks?
100%. It's an interesting one. So the default is unphishable, right? Things like YubiKeys, FIDO2, right? That's really, really important to use because that negates a whole host of those attack vectors that we talked about early on in the webinar. I've implemented them previously. There are edges and challenges with that, though. If you're relying on physical tokens, what if someone loses one? If I'm operating in multiple geographies, how the hell am I going to deliver them to people? So you've really got to think it through. But from a security perspective, that's the best possible answer. Moving down from that, you've got phish resistant, things like number matching in Authenticator via Entra. So that's good, not as strong as FIDO2, but a bit more flexible operationally to use. But particularly at the moment, and given the retail breaches in the UK and the threat actors there, anything OTP, SMSs, voice, those kind of things, really people are recommending to move away from. So unphishable is the gold standard, but you've really got to think about it, and it does cost a lot. And then you've got phish resistant, which is kind of the minimum barrier bar we should be aiming for right now.
Great, thank you, Rob. So I also just see we did have one more question about if the slides will be sent out after the session. We will be sending the recording to everybody. So not the slides, but the full recording. So you will have access to everything that Rob presented. So yeah, thank you once again, Rob. That's all of our questions done.
Awesome.
Thank you everyone for attending the session today. We really do appreciate you taking the time out to join us. As already mentioned, recording will be sent out to you all. And if you have any more questions, feel free to contact us and we'll get back to you as soon as possible. Thank you once again, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.